Hello everybody, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this. A simple image in Pygame that is going to rotate. In this case we're going to make Pikachu rotate. And ultimately this is quite an easy thing to do. But there is a couple of things you have to take care of, and if you don't do that, you end up with something like this, where everything goes wrong and then Pygame crashes. But yeah, that's basically it. Before we get into the actual code, let's first talk about how to rotate stuff in general in Pygame. There are two different ways to do it. The first one is rotate, the second one is rotozoom, both of which are methods of pygame.transform. And they are quite similar. Both are rotating an image and return a new image. But there are two differences that make rotozoom the better way of doing it. The first one doesn't matter all that much. All it is that rotozoom can both rotate and scale at the same time, which we don't need, so we're not going to use it, but it can be quite helpful. But the second one is really important, and that is that when rotozoom is used, it applies a filter to the rotated surface, which rotate does not do, and the result is that stuff rotated with rotozoom tends to look a little bit better. But that brings us to a really important point, and that is whenever you rotate anything in Pygame, you lose a tiny bit of quality on the surface you are rotating, which doesn't matter all that much if you only rotate something once. However, if you rotate a surface every frame and do that for a couple of seconds, you really easily end up with a few hundred rotations of the same surface. And if that happens, you end up with something that I've shown earlier, that the quality gets worse and worse and eventually Pygame crashes. So this is something we have to avoid. But we'll be crossing that bridge when we get to it. And let's first get started on the basic code. So here I am in a very basic Pygame setup. If you're completely new to Pygame, check out another video I made that explains all of this. But this is the most basic setup you can go with, and all it does is give us a blank screen that is white. So we have a surface that is 600 by 600 pixels wide, and we just fill it with white for now. So that's all we see, and we can't do anything for now. The first thing I want to do is add a picture to this. And I'm gonna store this in a variable I call pikachu. And to load an image, we need pygame.image.load. And then the name of the file. In my case, this is pikachu.png. And then this is going to be on a new surface. And to put this on the screen, we first need to get the rectangle around it. We're going to call it pikachu_rect. And this is going to be pikachu.getRect. And the center of it is going to be 300 and 300. So it's going to be right in the middle of our main screen. And now to draw this thing, all I need is screen.blit. Then I need Pikachu by itself, and then the rectangle. And if all of this makes no sense to you, check out another video I made. It explains all of this in detail, but for now I'm just going to focus on the rotation itself. But if we run this, we can see Pikachu right in the middle of our screen. So now we need to figure out how to rotate this thing. And to rotate it, we first need an angle. So I'm going to define an angle that is going to be 0 for now. And then in our game loop, I'm going to add 1 to this on every single frame. So now we need to figure out how to apply this angle to this surface. And here's where things can go wrong. So when we just get the surface, and apply pygame.transform. Let's start with rotate. And rotate just needs 2 arguments. The first one is the surface we want to rotate, which in our case is Pikachu. And then it needs an angle. So what happens now is we start with our Pikachu image. And then when we run this method, it takes the surface and rotates it by whatever angle we pass into it, then it saves it into this Pikachu variable. So we basically overwrite the original surface we had. And then on the next line, it just draws it on the main screen. But here's the problem: if we run this now, things are going terribly wrong and Pikachu leaves the screen. And the first point we can fix relatively easily. And that is simply that when we rotated the image, the rotation point changed. And this is why the image flew off the screen. And to fix that, all we need to do is recalculate the central point of the rectangle, so this one here. So when we have pikachu rect, it's going to be pikachu dot get rect, and center is again 300 times 300. If we run this now, we get to the case we saw earlier, where the image gets worse and worse, and eventually it crashes. And the reason for that is that this operation doesn't return the exact same surface on a rotation, it creates a new surface that is slightly lower quality. And if you do this over and over again, eventually the quality gets completely terrible. And we can improve this slightly by changing rotate to rotozoom, and now we need another argument, and that's the scale. Rotozoom needs 3 arguments. We have the surface we want to rotate, the angle we want to rotate, and the scale. And in our case, scale is just going to be 1, so there's no scaling. And if we run this now, I just need to make sure I type correctly. So now it already looks a little bit better, but it still crashes and it doesn't really work. And we want a good quality in this. And to fix all of this, let's talk about the logic we need. Right now, what happens is this. We take a surface, we rotate it by 1 degree, and then we paint it on the screen. And on the next frame, we take the same image, rotate it by another degree, and then draw all of this again. And we do this multiple times a second. In fact, we're doing it 30 times a second. But obviously, the more often we do this operation, the worse the quality becomes. And eventually it's going to look terrible. But this can be fixed, and here's how we are going to do this. Instead of reusing the same image over and over again, we're always going to start from the original surface and rotate it from that point. So instead of going from degree 1 to degree 2 to degree 3 and so on, we first go from degree 0 to 1, then from 0 to 2, then from 0 to 3, and so on. So that we effectively always rotate from the original point. And since this happens so many times per second, the user perceives this as a fluid motion. But effectively, we only rotate the original image once. Which leads us to not lose any quality, which is exactly what we want. And we are going to do all of this inside of a function. So here I'm back in my code. And the first thing I want to do is to create 2 new variables that are going to store the new surface we are going to create. I'm going to call this pikachu underscore rotated. And then I want another variable that stores pikachu rotated rect. And how I'm going to get both of these values is by creating a function that I'm going to call rotate. And into this function, we pass in the actual surface and the angle. So we basically have to create now a new function that's called rotate. It takes a surface and an angle. And in here, we're going to create the logic we need to rotate all of this. And the first thing we need is to get rid of all of this in our game loop that rotated it before. And we can put it into our function now. But we do have to make some changes. So instead of Pikachu, we now have surface. And this new surface is going to be stored in what I call rotated surface. And then when we get the rectangle, we also have to change some names. So it's going to be rotated surface. And I call this rotated rect. So let's go through what happened here. That right now, we still create an image that's called Pikachu. But when we come to the game loop, we are creating 2 new empty variables that are called Pikachu rotated and Pikachu rotated rect. So these are going to be the new surfaces and the new surface rectangle that we actually want to draw. So when we come to Blit, we don't want to draw the original image. We want to paint Pikachu rotated and Pikachu rotated rect. So that we never actually draw the original image. Instead, we take the image, we apply an angle to it, and then we draw it. And we do this on every single frame. But we always start from the original point. And now, inside of this function, and let me fix a typo. So inside of this function, we create a new surface, and this surface gets the rotation of our Pikachu image. And then from this rotated surface, we get the rectangle. And the important point here is that we store all of this inside of a new surface. We don't store it in the original, so we don't overwrite it. So let's say when we pass in Pikachu here on the first frame, and we apply a 1, then we get a new surface, and then this is drawn. But on the second frame, We still have the original Pikachu, so this thing here didn't change. But when we apply a 2 for the angle, it applies a 2 on this line as well, and we get Pikachu rotated by 2 degrees, but still from the original image. And all we need to do now is return the rotated surface and the rotated rect. And unless I made a mistake, this should be working reasonably well. And here we go. So now we have a rotating Pikachu. And if you wanted to rotate it clockwise, you just need to change the angle. And now it will rotate the other way around. So whatever you want to rotate. There's one thing you do want to be careful about. And that is that right now, we just use an image that already has a transparency. So PNG files always have a transparent background. But if you used a solid background, things might get slightly weird. And let me show an example. So instead of importing an image, I just want to create a plain surface that is going to be 200 by 200 pixels high and wide. And if I run this, we cannot see a rotation anymore. Instead, what we see is a rectangle that scales up and down, which isn't exactly helpful. But let me show you what actually happens here. So when I give Pikachu a fill and I fill it with a red color, now we can see what happens. This surface does not have a transparency by default, so it draws the background in black. And as a consequence, when this rectangle was black, we could only see the black rectangle growing and shrinking. So we need to give this surface a transparency, which actually is quite easy. All we need to do is on our pygame surface when we create it, we give it a second argument that is called pygame.transform.rotate. And this tells it to give this surface an alpha value, that if something isn't drawn on it, to just not draw anything at all. And if we run this now, we get a rectangle that rotates by itself and you can't see any black background. And that's basically it. I hope that was helpful and I'll see you around.